Slavery started in America around 1620 when about 20 slaves were purchased by a Dutch man to use as indentured workers for the English settlement of Jamestown. These slaves were among the first Africans in the colonies. Slaves then started arriving all over the colonies, including New York City, Connecticut, and Maryland. As slavery grew more popular, Connecticut felt it needed to legalize slavery, and they did in 1650. By this date, Rhode Island already had many large plantations worked by enslaved African Americans, and by 1690, all English colonies had enslaved African Americans. In 1700, a census was taken which reported that there were more than 27,000 enslaved people, mostly Africans, in the English colonies of North America, with the vast majority of these slaves living in the southern states. Before these results, slaves had always been viewed as items, not people, but things started to change when Massachusetts Chief Justice Samuel Sewall publishes The Selling of Joseph, a book that advances both the economic and moral reasons for the abolition of the trade in enslaved Africans. It was then that people, mainly in the North, started to rethink slavery and realized that slaves were people too. It took a while for the South to agree with the North, though, mainly because they had more plantations and more fertile land than the North, making the need for the slaves in the South increase. As the North tried to change the Southerners' minds about slavery, the South kept doing their thing on the plantations. They realized that if slavery ended, their economy would decrease greatly because the slaves were doing all the work for the crops and resources to be ready so that they could be sold, and without them, the landowners would lose money, making the economic state decrease all around. As slavery drastically changed America's economy, the political and cultural trends were changed too. For example, the political views of slavery began to change when it was abolished in New York in 1827. In 1830, African American delegates from New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia met in Philadelphia in the first series of National Negro Conventions to devise ways to challenge slavery in the South and racial discrimination in the North. Southerners did not like the idea that people were trying to change their views, and 1 year after Abraham Lincoln became president, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas seceded and created the Confederate States of America. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina seceded soon after. It was only 1 year later that the real political dispute showed, when the Civil War started. After 4 long years of battle, the war ended with the Union winning. The Union got what they wanted when Abraham Lincoln signed the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, outlawing slavery throughout the United States. The South was still very angry about losing the war, but mainly losing slavery, so they let people know how they felt. President Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, which is the same year that the war was over and that former Confederate veterans formed the Ku Klux Klan. It was things like these that started political and cultural changes, such as not having slavery in America. Because when we think, what if, we realize that our country had a very good chance of being totally different than it is now.
When the slave trade boats coming to the New World from Africa, the new slaves were suffering in terrible conditions. These conditions were horrific. Men, women, and children crammed into every space available, denied room, food, and breathing space. People dying from starvation and diseases all around, while the smell of death lingered throughout the entire boat. 10 to 20 million African Americans went through the slave trade process. Selling slaves at the auctions often resulted in African American families being separated. This was a terrible thing because husband and wives would get separated from each other and their children. When a man and a woman were very good workers, they were sometimes forced to breed to make children that would be good workers, even if they had a wife, husband, or other children. They were basically treated like animals. African Americans were not treated like human beings because of the pigment of their skin. Slaves often worked slowly, stole from their masters, and ran away because they hated the condition they had to live on. They knew that they were running away to another life. However, they did not know how to. This caused the making of the Underground Railroad.
To be free, African Americans would use the Underground Railroad. They felt this wasn't right to be hurt, mistreated, and punished for their colors, so they used songs to communicate instead of talking and getting heard. The KKK started in 1865. The KKK started from angry white people who felt threatened when they couldn't have their slaves since after the Civil War ended. They felt it wasn't right that they wouldn't have African Americans work for them, so they decided to burn and kill the African Americans. This still happens today, but not nearly as badly as it did before. I didn't know I was a slave until I found out I couldn't do things I wanted. Quoted by Frederick Douglass, who was a slave. This quote shows a great perspective of a slave because it shows how limited they are with their freedom and their rights. Whenever I hear anyone arguing for slavery, I feel a strong impulse to see it tried on him personally. Quoted by Abraham Lincoln, who is a previous president. This quote shows how he is very against slavery. The moment a man claims a right to control the will of a fellow being by physical force, he is, at heart, a slaveholder. Quoted by Henry C. Wright. And this shows how he is very against slavery and when a true slave becomes a real slave by having less rights and less freedom. Once slavery in America was not seen as radical, it became, instead, a revolutionary idea that slaves should be free. When we have lived under a pernicious power long enough, no matter how oppressive we grow, so accustomed to the yoke that its removal seems frightening, even so wrong. Quoted by Martin Luther King, speech in August 16, 1967. As you can see, the rest are maps of slavery and slaves and the slave trade.
African American leaders such as Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., and many others will always be remembered in their fight for their civil rights. These people who were at the start nothing but slaves stood up against the government in much of America for everything that they believed in, and became leaders throughout the process of making a difference. But this process didn't happen overnight. It was a long, hard fight over many years of violence, bloodshed, and cruelty towards the African American race. At a time, America denied all civil rights to the African Americans. Civil rights are the freedoms and rights that a person may have as a member of a community, state, or a nation. Slaves, more so in the South, were deprived of the right to marry, own property, testify in court, or earn their freedom. The events leading up to such an atrocity began back in the 1400s and 1500s when the slave trade was founded by the Portuguese sailors. The colonization of the New World during the 1500s resulted in a sudden uprising of slavery because many Europeans needed to survive based on the slaves' work. The African Americans started being transported from Africa to America and began their work as slaves. Most of America's southern states' economic state was dependent upon the work of slaves on plantations. By 1860, slave states had about 4 million slaves, which made up a third of the South's population. There was many effects on slavery that began to take its toll in the United States. As the African Americans were starting to get treated worse and worse, some Americans started turning against the wrongful act. As the North developed this idea more and more, the South could only think of the high profits that resulted from the slavery rather than the moral debate. Over time, the North started to turn more against slavery as the South grew more dependent of it. The whole Southern economy would collapse without slavery, and then things became violent. In the 1800s, true abolitionists were developed, and arguments began. The American Civil War took place during the years of 1861 to 1865. The war divided the United States in a fight versus family members, friends, and fellow American citizens. This conflict was against two parties, the United States and the states that seceded and made up the Confederate States of America. About 620,000 soldiers died during the Civil War. Through the years with many violent battles and a huge loss of men, the South eventually surrendered. The full effects of slavery played a major role in the economic development in the United States. The work of the slaves did pave the roads for America to grow and prosper. Another effect is all